We'll stand for the prayer and acknowledgement. Thanks. Lord, we ask that you guide us in our decision-making, protect us in the community we serve from all that is evil, and strengthen our unity for the welfare of the city. Amen. Amen. I'd like to acknowledge the Wiradjuri people as the traditional custodians of the land that we meet upon today, and pay my respects to the elders, both past, present and future, for they hold the memories, culture, tradition and hopes of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people that contribute to our community. Thank you. Recording and streaming of the meeting. This council meeting is being webcast and recorded. By speaking at the council meeting, you agree to being recorded and webcast. Please ensure that if and when you are speaking at this council meeting that you are respectful to other people and use appropriate language. AlburyCity accepts no liability for any defamatory or offensive remarks or gestures made during the course of this council meeting. An audio recording will be made for administrative purposes. CM2, CM3, conflict of interest declarations. I've not been made of any. Mr Zaknich.
None received. Thank you, Mr Mayor.
Disclosure of political donations.
Yes, thank you. The advice to the council meeting relates to the Environmental Planning and Assessment Act 1979. Section 147 requires a person submitting planning application or submissions regarding a planning application to disclose any reportable political donation and or gifts to any local councillor or employee of council. Reportable political donations include those of or above $1,000. The disclosure statement forms are available on Council's website or from the Customer Service Centre and must be lodged in accordance with the Act. The forms are also available at the back of the chamber during meetings. In dealing with development applications, councillors need to take into account specific matters contained in the Environmental Planning and Assessment Act 1979. Accordingly, the provisions of Section 79C1 of that Act are set out in the Council Officer's report, detailing issues to be considered. The Local Government Act 1993, Section 375A requires that a division be called whenever a motion for a planning decision is put at a meeting of the Council. Planning decision means a decision made in the exercise of a function of Council under the Environmental Planning and Assessment Act, including a decision relating to a development application, an environmental planning instrument, a development control plan or a development contribution plan under that Act, but not including the making of an order under Division 2A of Part 6 of that Act. Thank you, Mr Mayor.
Thank you, Mr Zaknich. Apologies. CM4, we have apologies. Thank you, councillors. Councillor Thurley.
Thank you, Mr Mayor. I move the council receive, note and accept the apology of Councillor King and grant leave of absence for the meeting.
Thank you. Councillor Doxey.
Happy to second, Mr Mayor.
Thank you. I have a question from Councillor Vanderman before I put the motion. Councillor Vanderman.
Is there anyone going to speak against this motion? Or?
It doesn't appear to be, Councillor Vanderman.
Oh, okay. Thank you.
Happy to put the motion. All those in favour? Anyone against? The motion is carried. CM5, there is no Merrill Minute. Action Plan 6.1 to 6.4. Thank you, councillors. Councillor Glacken.
Thank you. Through you, Mr Mayor, to move the recommendation that we receive and note the reports for those as a suite. Actions complete for noting, actions in progress and long-term issues, more than 3 months. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Thurley.
Second the motion.
Thank you. Councillor Glacken, did you wish to speak to that at all?
No, thank you.
Thank you. I've just got one question in relation to the action item regarding Granville Park, which is CM 13.2. I'm just wondering where the master plan's up to and if I get a response. Ms. Code.
Thank you for the question. Through you, Mr Mayor. The information is currently being compiled. We're just finalising further feedback. A report will be coming to Council in the new year.
Thank you. Councillor Cameron, you have a question?
Thank you, Mr Mayor. I have a question through you to the most appropriate member of staff. The motion moved by Councillor Glacken quite properly is that we receive and note the action plans. In receiving and noting the action plans, we are indicating, are we not, that we accept the action plans and we are content with the progress of them and we endorse them. Is that not the case?
Well, unless they ask questions,
Oh,
how would you know if they're receiving and noting?
With the greatest
they're happy with them.
With the greatest of respect to you, Mr Mayor, can I get an answer from an expert?
Oh, thank you. Mr Zaknich, you're the expert in tonight's proceedings.
Thanks for the elevation, Mr Mayor, through you. The receiving and noting the report indicates that Council has received and noted the information. As we've seen in the discussion, there are individual questions for clarification. but essentially the resolutions of the council are being provided to you in terms of their action taken and updates in terms of the progress with implementation. So council, by receiving and noting that, is acknowledging the status of those projects.
Thank you, Mr Mayor.
Thank you, Councillor Cameron. Okay, CM7, I'll put that motion. All those in favour? Anyone against? The motion is carried. CM7, the confirmation minutes of the previous meeting, minutes on the council meeting held on Monday the 12th of November. Thank you. Councillor Vanderveen.
Thank you, Mr Mayor. Happy to move the minutes of the council meeting held on Monday, 12 November 2018 at 6 p.m. No, I can't move that because I wasn't there. Oh, I can. All right. I'll move that they be confirmed. Thank you, Mr
Thank you.
Mayor.
Councillor Doxey.
I was happy to confirm, Mr Mayor.
Thank you. Councillor Vanderveen, did you wish to speak to those at all?
No, thank you, Mr Mayor.
Happy to put those. All those in favour? Anyone against? The motion is carried. CM8, the reports from Community Forum. There are none. There are no notices of motions or rescission. No presentations of deputation. CM11, reports and minutes of committees and working parties. CM11.1, minutes of Les O'Brien Athletics Precinct held on 7 November 2018. Thank you, councillors. Councillor Stutchbury.
Yes, thank you, Mr Mayor. I move that the minutes and recommendations of the Les O'Brien Athletics Precinct Committee meeting held on the 7th of November 2018 be received, noted and accepted.
Thank you. Councillor Thurley.
Second the motion, Mr Mayor.
Thank you. Councillor Stutchbury, do you wish to speak to that at all?
No, thank you.
Thank you. There are no further questions or debate. Councillor Cameron, do you wish to speak to that or?
I thought I'd second it if it's not been seconded.
It's been seconded by Councillor Thurley.
Excellent.
Thank you. Happy to put that motion. All those in favour? Anyone against? The motion is carried. Thank you. CM 11.2, the minutes of the Aquatics Facility Advisory Committee held on the 14th of November 2018. Councillor Thurley.
Thank you, Mr Mayor. I move the minutes and recommendation of the Aquatics Facility Advisory Committee meeting held on the 14th of November be received, noted and accepted.
Thank you. Councillor Glacken.
Thank you. Happy to second that motion of Councillor Thurley's.
Thank you. Councillor Thurley, do you wish to speak to that at all?
No, if anyone were to speak, it would be Councillor Glacken, who was the present at the meeting.
Yeah, I forgot Councillor Glacken was the chair. Councillor Glacken, did you wish to speak to that?
Thank you, and I do apologise for that.
Split second time.
Yes.
It's like the chaser.
Councillor
He's on the
Thurley
button
and I.
very quickly.
Just to note that it was in essence the final meeting of the committee, or likely to be the final meeting of that committee, in anticipation of the combined meeting in the future for both cities. And I'll just check that those councillors over there aren't falling off chairs.
You're right there.
Right. And at that meeting, as I explained to the members of the committee, that it was an extremely significant amount of work that they had undertaken. It was a number of committees that had also, or a number of iterations of a number of committees, and at least one member of that committee had been on each of those committees. And I confirmed that we as a council had listened to them and had taken feedback from them as a group, and confirmed, as I had said in the council meeting 2 meetings ago, that committee had been extremely active and very responsible in the way they had dealt with the way in which we had been developing our strategy at that time. So again, I put on record that we as a council are most grateful for their work and look forward to similar work being undertaken by a new committee. Thank you, Mr Mayor.
Thank you, Councillor Glacken. I have a question from Councillor Cameron. Councillor Cameron, question.
Thank you, Mr Mayor. Through you to the most appropriate member of staff. Previous resolutions of council were that we seek, or that the General Manager prepare a report as to the practicality of having a cross-border Aquatic Facilities Advisory Committee. Can I just briefly inquire, has there been any progress in that?
Thank you. Mr Zachnich.
Thank you, Mr Mayor, and through you for the question. as detailed in the action plan that Councillor Stephen noted a short while ago, the report on that matter will be presented to the December council meeting.
Further question, Mr Mayor, please.
Yeah.
Have we had any response from Wodonga on this subject yet?
Mr Sacknage.
No formal response at this stage. We have written formally and had initial discussions with Wodonga Executive, and we await their formal response to be included in the report to Albury City Council in December.
Second question, Mr Mayor, if I may.
Yep.
Through you to the most appropriate member of staff. At what point do we need to either reform, and I understand there's been a resignation from this current committee of council, this current Aquatics Facility Advisory Committee. I may be wrong about that, but I'd been told there'd been a resignation of one of the stakeholders. At what time is it appropriate to seek new membership or reaffirm the existing membership of this committee? Or will that be contingent, I suppose, on what happens with the attempt to get Wodonga to form a joint committee?
Mr Sacknage.
Thanks for the question through you, Mr Mayor. So Council has an annual process in September and October each year. The committee's representation is reviewed. Committees are reviewed by Council, working committees and working groups. If the current Albury City Aquatics Advisory Committee were to continue in its form, we would advertise for those current vacancies. Council may well decide, based on feedback, that they may wish to retain the Albury committee structure going forward, depending on feedback around a joint committee. On that basis, we'd look to refresh terms of reference, representation and the like at that time. But we'll endeavour to cover off on those options in the report to Council in December, based on any feedback we do get from the City of Wodonga.
Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Thurley, you wish to speak to close debate on this motion?
No, thank you, Mr Mayor.
Thank you. Happy to put the motion. All those in favour? Anyone against? The motion is carried. Team 12, documents for sealing. Thank you. Councillor Vanderman.
Thank you, Mr Mayor. I move the recommendation that Council authorises its seal to be affixed to the documents outlined below in the presence of two signatories authorised to affix the seal pursuant to Regulation 400 of the Local Government General Regulation 2005 and the Council seal and management of legal documents and advice procedure, a Certificate of Authority under the Swimming Pools Act 1992 for Team Leader Compliance, Andrew Hill.
Thank you. Councillor Thurley.
I'll second the motion.
Thank you. Councillor Vanderman, do you wish to speak to that?
No.
Happy to put the motion. All those in favour? Anyone against? The motion is carried. Council meeting scheduled for December 2018. 13.1. Councillor Doxey.
Thank you, Mr Mayor. I move the recommendation that Council endorse the Council meeting on Monday 24 December 2018 be rescheduled to Monday 17 December 2018.
Thank you. Councillor Vanderman.
Happy to second, Mr Mayor.
Thank you. Councillor Doxey, you wish to speak to that at all?
Simply to make sense, we need to get away and get our Christmas presents wrapped up.
Ho, ho, ho. Okay. Happy to put that motion. All those in favour? Anyone against? The motion is carried. Thank you. 13.2, Council meeting scheduled for 2019. Thank you, councillors. Councillor Thurley.
I move that Council adopt the draft Council meeting schedule for 2019.
Thank you. Councillor Stutchbury.
Second that, Mr Mayor.
Councillor Thurley, do you wish to speak to that at all?
No, thank you. It's a routine matter.
Happy to put the motion. All those in favour? Anyone against? The motion is carried. CM 13.3, the AlburyCity's Memorandum of Understanding 2019 to 2023. Councillor Con.
Thank you, Mr Mayor. I move that Council A continue its participation in the AlburyCity's program until the 30th of June 2023 and B authorise the Mayor and General Manager to execute the Memorandum of Understanding between the AlburyCities for the period 2019-20 to 2022-23.
Thank you. Councillor Vanderman.
Very happy to second, Mr Mayor.
Thank you. Councillor Con, did you wish to speak to that?
Only briefly, Mr Mayor. Firstly, to acknowledge your leadership as the chair of the Evo Cities. Certainly in the last week or so, there's been a significant raise in the profile of Albury across the state, and that's a fantastic effort. But I did want to comment on the funding of the Evo Cities, noting that the combined funding from all of the councils that are members in New South Wales totalled $4.27 million, and that group has only received $530,000 of state funding. We've got a state government that talks a lot about decentralisation and regional development, and it's disappointing that they don't see providing more funding to the Evo Cities as a priority.
Thank you, Councillor Con. Councillor Vanderman, to speak for.
Thank you, Mr Mayor. This Evo Cities has been in place now for pretty close to 10 years. I think it's coming up to 10 years when we first started talking about it at this council chamber. And if you just look at the bare results that on page 38, 3,619 new households identified are only the relocators who've had direct contact with Evo City staff and confirmed they've made the move. If you translate that into residents and ratepayers, on an ongoing basis, the economic impact of those new residents to all of our cities is absolutely massive, and the small cost to this community of maintaining our involvement with Evo Cities is paying off in spades. Thanks, Mr Mayor.
Thank you, Councillor Vanderman. Just to finish off, there are no more speakers for and against, but the Evo Cities platform in its early days received $1.7 million from the federal government. We've got a live application in with the Deputy Premier's office at the moment for continued funding over the period of our journey of $500,000 a year, which will value add to the current contributions we're providing. I do agree with Councillor Con and probably other councillors that it's a policy of the state and federal government to alleviate their congestion, and we're yet again cost shifting and doing it on their behalf. But if we didn't do it, then we'd be lesser for the experience. So thank you for support, councillors. And Councillor Con, did you wish to close debate?
No, thank you, Mr Mayor.
Thank you. Happy to put that motion. All those in favour? Anyone against? The motion is carried. T-Corp Investment Policy Exposure Limits 13.4. Councillor Thurley.
Thank you, Mr Mayor. I move that Council A note the written response received by AlburyCity on behalf of the New South Wales Local Government Minister regarding investment policy exposure limits. B, that Council monitor and support advocacy efforts by LGNSW on behalf of councils regarding this issue. C, endorse that AlburyCity continue to maintain the level of its investments with WAW in the Hume Bank, while further clarification is being sought for the New South Wales Government. And D, receive a further update following any application for loan funding to T-Corp by AlburyCity.
Thank you. Councillor Stutchbury?
Yes, happy to second that, Mr Mayor.
Thank you. Councillor Thurley, did you wish to open debate?
Yes, thank you, Mr Mayor. This, and it's been said many times in this chamber, that this policy by the state government is an appalling policy. It threatens councils who invest with their local community banks and building societies. And if we don't reduce the investments that we have, we will incur extra borrowing funds of up to $200,000 a year from T-Corp. They paint this as if it's a risk issue, and that's utterly ludicrous. We have $4 million with Hume Bank, which represents 0.4% of their total customer investments. And we have $5 million with WAW, which is 1.2% of their total customer deposits. To say this is a risk is utterly stupid, but that's what we're getting, and we get it all the time. I understand that risk is something the government needs to be aware of, and I understand that so does council need to be aware of those risks when investing ratepayers' funds. But this is a sledgehammer to crack a nut. It's a stupid policy, and I believe, I know Greater Humeshire has also made this point, and I believe we need to continue to make the point so that we can support the Hume Bank and WAW, and other councils around the state can support their local communities. While we're being told that we have to do this, and if it's okay if we put it with the ANZ or CBA or any of the other big ones, Where are the biggest risks? It seems to me, as Councillor Suchbury said in an earlier debate, that the risks don't lie with Hume Bank and WAW. They lie with the big banks. So I think this is a terrible policy by New South Wales Government, and we need to continue our advocacy as it says in item B. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, but speaker 4, Councillor Glacken, you have a question?
Yes, I can. Can I seek... thank you, Mr Mayor, sorry. Through you to the most relevant member of staff. And I'm happy if this needs to be taken as on notice, but can we get some feedback on some investments that we've had in the past that were part of the CDO portfolio? And my understanding is that some of those were sold through some of those big 4 banks or some of the organisations that we are now able to invest in. Can we get some information on that just to clarify what the risk is with some of those other organisations that we're allowed to invest with against the Hume and WAW? Mr Chair.
Mr Finlayson.
Through you, Mr Mayor. Previously, AlburyCity did hold investments that were a type called CDOs, or collateralised debt obligations, at the time of the GFC. The council held them with the major banks, but also an organisation known as Lehman Brothers, which went into financial difficulty. AlburyCity didn't have any difficulty in receiving its investments from the major banks regarding CDOs on maturity. However, we did, obviously, with the administration of Lehman Brothers, which is continuing. So I'm happy to provide any further detail if required.
Councillor Glacken, you have a follow-up?
Yes, if I may, a clarifying question. So the CDOs were a group of investments that were provided by a number of providers, including the big 4 banks. And my memory is that when we invested in CDOs, they were on the list of acceptable investments at that time. Can I have that clarified, please?
Mr Finlayson.
Yes, thank you for the question. Through you, Mr Mayor. Following the global financial crisis, an investment order was issued by the local government minister, which still stands, which precludes councils from investing with CDOs. However, that wasn't in place at the time, but was a change as a result of the experience that everyone had.
Thank you, Mr Finlayson. Yep, thank you. Councillor Vanderman, wish to speak for the motion.
Just following on from the subject of the conversation that Councillor Glacken started, it's my recollection, in fact, that the CDOs were encouraged and approved by Treasury and the Office of Local Government at the time that they were about. So if we're talking about risk here, they obviously don't really know what they're talking about. It's also a little disappointing to see that whilst this has come from the office of the Honourable Gabrielle Upton, she's not considered this matter important enough to have her signature on the letter, but putting it through to a parliamentary secretary for planning. But I take exception to the second half of the second last paragraph, which basically said there's no obligation for councils to borrow from T Corp if they do not wish to meet the conditions of borrowing. And I really think that that's pretty ordinary, and I fully concur with Councillor Thurley in the comments that he made. We need to be hammering the state government around this particular issue. Thanks, Mr Mayor.
Thank you, Councillor Vanderman. There are no further speakers for or against. Councillor Thurley, just to close debate.
That's fine, thank you.
Thank you. Happy to put the motion. All those in favour? Anyone against? The motion is carried. 13.5, September quarter budget review. Thank you. Yep. Councillor Glacken.
Thank you, and I'll find the page. I'll try to read off the board. Through you to move the recommendation that Council A recontribute funds received by AlburyCity of $28,868.02 to the wind-up of Ramrock to the recently established Ramjo. B, receive and adopt the revised budget estimates for the 2018-19 financial year. C, Note the supplementary reports including the consultancy and legal expenditure and contract expenditure listing. D, authorise the General Manager to make application to the New South Wales Treasury Corporation for the budgeted credit foncier loan funding of up to $14.5 million. E, further assess the required amount of loan funding to be drawn down by 30 June 2019 as part of the March quarter budget review. And F, authorise the General Manager to approve the fixed term rate period that represents best value for money. Mr Mayor.
Thank you. Councillor Stutchbury.
Second that, Mr Mayor.
Councillor Gluck, do you wish to open debate? I have a question.
I'll reserve my right of reply and happy to take questions.
Thank you. Councillor Vanderman, question.
Just on page 51 of the electronic copy under executive, it's got a deterioration is the $25,000 council decision to provide donation to buy a bail, where I don't believe that that's the decision that we made. We made a decision around options around a donation, not specifically buy a bail. That's just I suppose being pedantic to an extent, but that's, I realise that my emotion was changed to that impact.
Thank you, Councillor Vanderman. Mr Zachnich, did you wish to comment?
Yes, thank you for the question through you, Mr Mayor. That's correct, Councillor Vanderven. Apologies for that. That was only one of the options for consideration by the council through the, ideally through a regional approach through the Riverina and Murray Joint Organisations, or RAMJO, as they're now called. Simply identifying that that amount of money has been earmarked for the drought assistance support that Council resolved some time ago. And a further update on that is that the regional approach is still being worked through by RAMJO with respect to where the best possible outcome for that drought assistance might be from a regional perspective.
Just a follow-up,
Yep.
if I could, and it's probably not the right time, but understanding the response that Mr Zachnich just gave, the drought's on at the moment. Is there a chance that we might hasten that decision? Or would you like me to raise that in urgent?
I can respond now. Yeah. Certainly. So RAMJO met last week to discuss that very issue amongst other important regional issues, and hopefully that matter will be resolved in the very near future.
Thank you. If there are no further questions or debate, Councillor Gluck, do you wish to close debate?
Thank you, Mr Mayor. This is the first quarter of our current budget. There are a number of things that need to be ironed out. Within that, we're a large business. Lots of things happen. There needs to be tweaking as we go along the way. Major projects are moved, brought forward, held off, or indeed completely changed by us as council through our decision-making processes. All of this needs to be dealt with in this paperwork and this report. And I was very mindful last week when Councillor Thurley and I were at an audit committee meeting as to just how complicated the finances of council are, and the reporting of those finances are by some of the questions asked by members, the external members of the audit committee. The finances or the reporting of our finances of council are not normal reporting processes. They are specific to local government and they work on an annual basis. We, in our businesses, those of us who own a business, or we in our households, don't have those annual financial reporting needs, and our bank accounts remain open. As council, those bank accounts remain open, but we have to report on those annually. And so the adjustments that we make as we go through can be a little daunting for people to read if they're not aware of the intricacies of local government, or indeed government at any level, when we look at the determinations such as deteriorations, etc. Sometimes the deterioration is actually a good thing for us. It's actually a positive income source coming to us as opposed to an actual deterioration. It simply means that it's against what we had anticipated, whether that is money coming in or money going out. So I'm very mindful of that, having sat through the audit committee meeting last week. And I'm also mindful of the fact that this is a significant period where we do make significant changes because we've commenced our new budget and we're a third of the way through that, or a quarter of the way through that. Thank you, Mr Mayor.
Thank you, Councillor Glacken. On that note, I'll put the motion. All those in favour? Anyone against the motion is carried. The 13.6 is development application 10.2018.3631.15.1. Councillor Con.
Thank you, Mr Mayor. I'd like to move that A, Council receive and note the contents of this report. B, grant consent to development application 10.2018.36315.1 for change of use retail premises and ancillary uses, comprising demolition of the large shade structure over the former nursery area, alterations and additions to the building to create 6 tenancies, change of use from the previous use as a hardware and building supplies outlet to retail premises and ancillary uses, and advertising signage subject to the conditions contained in the draft determination included in this report at attachment 4. And I'd like to add a part C, please. The draft conditions of consent are to be amended to include the following. Condition A12, insert additional bullet point landscaping requirements as required by condition A16. And under condition B3, insert A16 after A15 and insert condition A16 as follows. Car parking landscaping. Landscaping to be provided to car parking area on the western boundary fronting Young Street from the northern boundary of the site through to the proposed new entry/exit. The landscaping is to comprise mature trees of a minimum height of 3 metres at the time of planting and similar species to the existing street trees in this location. Trees are to be evenly spaced and located at every 5th parking space or part thereof.
Thank you. Councillor Stutchbury.
Yes, I'd like to second the motion and the amendment. Thank you.
Thank you. I have a question first. Councillor Con, do you wish to take the question or wish to open debate?
I'll open debate. It might be addressed.
Okay.
Thank you, Mr Mayor. This is obviously a very high-profile development site for our city, and I just wanted to take the opportunity to explain the amendment to the recommendation that I've made. I believe since this is such a high-profile entry to our city, from a tourism point of view, it's important that we improve the visual amenity of this site if at all possible. I've had discussions with our staff. Obviously, part of the car park is on top of the underground car park, and planting can't be undertaken there. But between the northern boundary and the entry and exit, that is a regular car park where it's possible to plant trees which will provide shade for pedestrians as well as improve the visual amenity coming into the city. The application as it stands has 11 more car parks than required by the DCP, so the handful of car parks that would be lost to replace with trees are easily accommodated by the existing parking requirements. Thanks.
Thank you, Amanda Con. Councillor Glacken.
Thank you. My question was somewhat answered by the opening of debate. However, the potential for losing car parking spaces, whilst they are over the minimum requirement by 11, my question to the staff is it possible to still have the treescaping without losing any or minimising the number of car parks to be lost? Thinking of perhaps if they had a space for trolley returns, don't know if they would, could those be incorporated as part of the treed area? Or if they had the option to have parking for smaller vehicles only so as to maintain as many car parks as possible while still including the treescaping. Mr Mayor.
Mr Keys.
Thank you, Mr Mayor. Thank you for the question. One of the areas that we have looked at in regards to this is there's provision for motorcycle parking, and if the trees were located to the rear or close to the boundary of the car park, then we could still try and squeeze the motorcycle spaces in at the front of those bays, so that could result in the loss of 2 car parks potentially. But there are options there to be looked at.
I have 2 speakers running against. You happy for me to take another question, Councillor Thiel and Councillor Vanderman? Yep. Councillor Stutchbury.
Thank you, Mr Mayor. Through you to the relevant member of staff. One of Albury's 2 worst spots for illegal U-turns is the intersection of Young Street and Wilson Street. And paradoxically, when Bunnings closed, the number of U-turns at that intersection dropped dramatically, despite It didn't drop, Councillor Van der Ven? Okay, scratch that. It may have reduced somewhat, but almost imperceptibly. Presuming that half the customers to this new development are going to drive to it from the north of Albury, and in order to get back to the north of Albury from the development, they're going to, if they exit onto Young Street, they're going to have to zigzag through Young Street, Wilson Street, David Street, Guinea Street, and then back to the north. Is there any avenue here open to discussing with the proponent improving vehicular access of customers back towards the north of this city from that development?
Mr. Keys. Through you, Mr. Mayor, again, thank you for the question. The issue of traffic exiting the site was certainly raised and discussed with the proponents right from the start. There is still the option, as previously existed, to access Wilson Street intersection from the site directly by going down through the basement, and quite a number of people do utilise that. This option is to relieve that, to provide an entrance and exit directly near the entry to Amart Furniture. It was a requirement and a very strong position of the tenant that's proposed to take this on. In discussions and deliberation with RMS, who are the final sign-off and authority for this road, they were certainly given the advice that if that entrance exit was not provided in that proposed form, the development was unlikely to proceed. So it was very strong questions raised about the access, the evidence provided, as well as the option to drive through the site, go down to the basement and come out to the easy turn and the signalised turn on Wilson Street was encouraged and accepted, and that's the position that's been taken by RMS, and we've accepted that referral.
Councillor Stachbury.
This is not a question, it's more a comment. Not all vehicles are able to exit from the top car park down the ramp and do the sharp turn into Wilson Street due to height restrictions, as well as just the space available if there's a trailer on, for example. So that is a partial solution, but it's not a complete solution to the problem.
Thank you, Councillor Stachbury. Speaker 4, Councillor Thurley.
Thank you, Mr Mayor. Just a very brief comment. It's great to see this site is going to be redeveloped. That whole area of town from the railway precinct upwards has looked a bit desolate of late, and I do commend the additional part of this motion to have some landscaping. Basically, it looked like a concrete jungle previously when it was Bunnings, and maybe that's not a bad look for a hardware store. But this is a furniture precinct and retail premises, and it needs a bit of softening in my opinion, and it is in a very high profile area. And as you drive down Young Street from the north, you emerge from a tree-lined street into a concrete jungle. So I commend the third part.
Thank you. Speaker against, Councillor Van der Ven.
Thank you, Mr Mayor. Just prior to my speaking against, can I get an estimation of how many of these mature trees are going to be planted?
Mr Keys. Through Mr Mayor, based on the car parks that is shown in the current design, there's about 21 spaces identified between the access exit and the northern boundary. So we're probably looking around approximately 4 trees.
Thank you. Thank you for the answer to that. I just don't see the point. If we're going to worry about that this is an access to our city, we've already allowed a new service station on the corner of Guinea Street and Barella Road. I cannot... If you want some trees, by all means, go and plant 4 trees in the Botanic Gardens or somewhere else, but this is just an absolute waste of time, and whilst I will vote for A and B, I vote against item C, so I will give forewarning that I will be moving an alternative motion, which is the original motion as it appears in our paperwork, should this one fail. I honestly just cannot see the point why we're putting this in for 4 trees. put them on the nature strip by all means, but don't put them in here. It's been the same for 15 years. It's a concrete jungle, but it was a concrete jungle for 15 years. And we've still got a service station on the corner of Barella Road and Guinea Street, which is closer to our entrance to our city than the old Bunnings store, the new Amart store. And I'm sure that they'll do some treatment around making that whole area look less like a concrete jungle than what it did before, because Bunnings build concrete jungles. Amart probably don't want one. Anyway, it's opportunism at its very worst with making a motion for 4 trees. Thanks, Mr. Mayor.
Thank you, Councillor Vanderman. There being no further speakers for or against, I'd just like to finish up debate by suggesting that it's been a long time issue for me in terms of that being the entrance to our city, one of the main entrances to our city, and I've spoken with the directors about the boundaries on the opposite side of the intersection where we've got the Aldi car park and the associated businesses. It's a bit of a eyesore, that whole precinct, and I would have thought that 4 trees are better than none. Whilst I do sympathise with Councillor Vanderman that the nature strip could be an appropriate place too, well, we'll put some in the nature strip as well. But I think, again, looking in the future, we need to consider that precinct and not let it get to where Wagga Road got because of the highway. I can see we're going to have to spend some money in there in the near future to make it look at least a little bit more attractive to visitors to the city, because at the moment they'll only be pulling up that petrol station, filling up with fueling, doing an illegal U-turn to leave Albury and get back on the highway. So we need to do what we can do to ensure that they stay. So thank you for that. Councillor Glack, can I have one question before I come?
Yes, before Councillor Con closes
Yep.
debate, can I ask, and I believe it to be the case, that whilst we might have in this motion, should this motion get up, that there needs to be a certain number of trees, etc. My understanding is that it might be possible for the developers to actually seize this as an opportunity and put in further trees without necessarily removing or treescaping or hedgescaping or something, without the need to remove car parking or to decrease car parking any further. Might that be the case?
Mr Keys.
Through you, Mr Mayor, thank you again for the question. The car park as proposed, because of the alignment to allow for passage of vehicles in both directions, is extremely tight. There is very limited opportunity, therefore, to adjust or change the size of the car parks to provide for additional space for landscaping. They're also providing for pedestrian passage, safe pedestrian passage undercover across the front of the shops, the proposed shops that isn't there at the moment and hasn't been provided in the past because there was only one entrance to Bunnings which significantly stood out from the front of the building. Therefore, any further opportunities would be extremely limited and potentially very difficult. The other element that I would just caution on is the number of car parks that's shown in the calculations is very heavily based on the floor area that's designated for the proposed uses, and that's a distinction between a bulky goods type arrangement such as a major large furniture store versus a retail outlet. If the warehouse that's proposed to support the bulky goods or the Amart furniture store was to be adjusted in floor area, there may well be a shortage of car parking spaces based on the existing numbers.
Thank you, Mr Keys. Councillor Vanderman, do you have another question?
On the basis of the answer just provided to that last question, so if there is a change and we approve this particular thing, what happens to the trees? They get chopped down or what?
Mr Keys.
Thanks again for the question. I believe that with the consideration that we've given about utilising motorcycle spaces to offset in those car parks that are lost and the small number of car parks that are proposed to be taken up, there's flexibility in the design as it exists.
Thank you, Mr Keys. Councillor Con, did you wish to close debate?
Yes, thank you, Mr Mayor. Councillor Vanderman is right. We're talking about approximately 4 trees. I didn't think we'd actually have to have a debate about this. We're also talking about the equivalent loss of approximately 4 car parks or even less than that. We've got to make a decision based on the proposed use in the development application and not speculate about future changes of use. We know from the community consultation that we did as part of the DCP review that the community highly values our leafy streets. Unfortunately, this section is a bit of a concrete jungle. I presume that was from when Young Street was still a highway and the opportunity wasn't taken to do a better job of it. But we have an opportunity to marginally improve the outcome for the community, and I think we should do so.
Thank you, Councillor Con. On that note, I'll put the motion as a division. All those in favour? Councillor Stutchbury, Councillor Doxey, Councillor Mack, Councillor Con, Councillor Glacken and Councillor Thurley. Those against? Councillor Cameron and Councillor Vanderman. The motion is carried. Thank you, councillors. 14.1, Corporate Health Indicator, September 2018. Councillor Stutchbury.
Yes, thank you, Mr Mayor. I move that Council receive and note the September 2018 Corporate Health Indicators Report.
Thank you. Councillor Thurley.
Second the motion.
Councillor Stutchbury, I have a question. Did you wish me to take the question for you? Start open debate? Do you wish to open debate? Yes, you want me to take the question. You want open debate? No,
Take the question, please, Mr Mayor.
Okay. Councillor Con.
Thank you, Mr Mayor. I have a question through you to the relevant member of staff, but noting that Mr Zachnich is currently occupied with another conversation.
Yep. No worries.
Yes, sorry.
Question?
Thank you, Mr Zachnich. My question is noting that our trainee staffing levels are currently below target, and we've previously done excellent work in that area to make sure that we are training our succession plan. Just wondering what actions are currently in place to get our trainee staffing levels back up to target.
Mr Zachnich.
Yes, thanks for the question through you, Mr Mayor. So the focus again in the new calendar year will be significant recruitment at the trainee level again. It is cyclical, so running at around 45 trainees, cadets, apprentices at this stage, which is close to our 10%, but the target's obviously at 50, close to 50, so we'll be working towards that again in the new calendar year.
Councillor Con.
Thank you.
Councillor Stutchbury, do you wish to open debate?
No, it's pretty self-explanatory, Mr Mayor.
Thank you. Councillor Vanderman, question.
Yes, Mr Mayor, through you to the relevant member of staff. Just interesting to note the development application processing graph, and whilst there's been a big improvement in the average processing time from 134 days to 108, roughly. Eh? Oh, processing time. Oh, sorry. From 44 days or 45 days to 35. Is there and we have that state average process time there. Is there a chance to have one extra line on the graph which indicates what our objective is to get to?
Mr Keys.
Through you, Mr Mayor, thank you for the question. The dark blue line, which indicates target processing time, is the ideal. It's about 20 days is our target.
Thank you. Sorry, I missed that.
Thank you. And while I've got you, while I've got you, Mr Keys, I do see a marked decrease in that time from August to September, and it's a credit to the staff. And you've got staff on board now, and it's great to see that we're getting well below the benchmark, given that it's up around 140 days for the state average. Thank you very much.
No, sorry, 46 days.
46, sorry, yeah. You and I get the same numbers wrong. 46, yeah. Okay. Well, you had Councillor Stutchbury. Did you wish to close debate?
No, thank you, Mr Mayor.
Happy to put the motion. All those in favour? Anyone against? The motion is carried. Yes, thank you. 14.2, the monthly development statistics, October 2018. Thank you, Councillor. Thank you, Councillor Vanderman.
Thanks, Mr Mayor. I move the Council receive, note and accept the information in the monthly development statistics for October 2018 report.
Thank you. Councillor Stutchbury.
Second that, Mr Mayor.
Councillor Vanderman, do you wish to speak to that?
No, but I'll change that to yes, only briefly, but to indicate that from what I've seen over the past 12 to 18 months, it continues really good, healthy development in AlburyCity, both from a residential and a commercial perspective. Thanks, Mr. Mayor.
Thank you. There are no further questions or debate. Happy to put the motion. All those in favour? Anyone against? The motion is carried. 14.3, investment balances, October 2018. Councillor Vanderman.
Happy to move the recommendation that Council receive and note the investment balances report for the month of October 2018.
Thank you. Councillor Stutchbury.
Happy to second, and I have a question.
Thank you. Councillor Vandervan, you happy to take the question?
Take the question.
Councillor Stutchbury.
My question is to the relevant member of staff. Is there any possibility that we as a council can invest a greater volume or quantum of money into WAW and Hume Bank?
Mr. Finlayson.
Thank you for the question. Through you, Mr. Mayor, our policy as it's currently approved by Council does allow us to increase our investments with Hume Bank and WAW. The current practice is to hold our investments with Hume Bank and WAW while we're working through issues regarding potential loan applications to T Corp. So I propose that we revisit that in the coming months.
Councillor Stutchbury, comfortable with that?
Only if Mr. Finlayson promises to revisit it.
He's promising. Councillor Vanderman, did you wish to open debate on this?
I was actually going to ask some questions along the same lines as Councillor Stutchbury, and perversely to increase the amount of money that we invest with Hume Bank and WAW and let Treasury and the Office of Local Government know that that's what we've done. Thanks, Mr. Mayor.
Okay. There are no further questions on debate. Happy to put the motion. All those in favour? Anyone against? The motion is carried. 14.4, the Growing Thurgoona Community Feedback. Thank you. Councillor Con.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I move that Council receive and note the report on the Growing Thurgoona Community Conversations.
Thank you. Councillor Doxey.
Happy to second, Mr. Mayor.
Thank you. Councillor Con, do you wish to open debate on that?
Only very briefly, Mr. Mayor, to comment in the context of several very controversial development applications earlier this year and soon to come, that when asked what should Council improve in Thurgoona of the 518 responses that we got, the number one issue raised by respondents was traffic flow, and number two was more green spaces and parks.
Thank you. Councillor Doxey, you have a question.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I just want to make a simple statement, if I may, at the end, if I can question if you like. I want to congratulate the staff on this initiative. A number of councillors around this table were there. I was there for 3 hours in the morning. Having been a resident of Thurgoona, I was able to grab ex-residents, neighbours of mine, and drag them into the mix. But I think it was great. So staff to be congratulated. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Doxey. Whilst there are no questions or further debate, I just wanted to ask a question probably to Mr Ferris. In relation to that number one item, I noticed through some of my reading that we're getting close to a solution with Thurgoona Drive and Queen Elizabeth.
Through you, Mr Mayor. The design preliminary concepts have been forwarded to RMS, awaiting their response. The design process is well underway. Council will recall that we have $200,000 in this year's budget to commence the works, and then $1.6 million in next year's budget. We'll be looking to go to tender in early 2019, February, March, award, and commence work shortly thereafter.
Okay. Councillor Con, do you wish to close debate?
No, thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Put the motion. All those in favour? Anyone against? The motion is carried. CM 14.5, the Mumma Annual Report. Thank you, councillors. Councillor Thurley.
Thank you, Mr Mayor. I move that Council A receive and note the Mumma Annual Report 2017-18 and B, acknowledges the support and efforts of the Mama Advisory Committee, volunteers, Mo Mama, Mama Art Foundation, sponsors, donors, funding bodies and supporters.
Thank you. Councillor Stutchbury.
Second that, Mr Mayor.
Thank you. Councillor Thurley, do you wish to open debate on that item?
Yes, thank you, Mr Mayor. Basically, the Mama seems to be going from strength to strength. We've had apparently 136,000 people attended last year, which is a growth of about 30%. A lot of those are school groups doing organised programs. The shop sales have increased by about 30%, and the financial result is 7% favourable to budget. The other night we had the Sydney Nolan exhibition, which has been provided to the city free of charge, basically by the generosity of many sponsors, commercial and otherwise, in Albury. We also, on the same night, were given two highly commended awards for, one was for an exhibition last year called Material Sound, earlier this year. I've forgotten exactly when it was. But basically, Mama's profile is increasing all the time, and a great deal of respect from the National Gallery and the New South Wales Art Gallery. So it's a very positive result, and the staff and all involved should be commended.
Thank you, Councillor Thurley. I just have one question, probably to Ms Code, in relation to Mama. There were 31 new works donated during the period, but my understanding is that there are significant donations raised by the Foundation, Mo Mama, etc. Have we got a number on that at this point, Ms Code?
Thank you for the question through you, Mr Chair. The exact number I don't have in front of me, but I'll certainly put that on notice and provide that information.
Do you have a ballpark figure on that one? We've heard it bandied around here a couple of times. Can we get an update on the current proceedings? I know that there's been significant financial support. Thank you. On that note, I'm happy to put the motion. All those in favour? Anyone against? The motion is carried. 14.7, the Albury, 14.6, Albury Wodonga Aquatics Facilities Management Update. Councillor Con. Yes, Councillor Cameron.
Councillor Con had a light on before the vote of the last matter was taken.
Yes, Councillor Cameron.
That's not in order.
Do you want me to start again, Councillor Cameron?
Yes, thanks.
So this is like the chaser. We'll see who press their button first.
That's it.
Excellent. Hang on, you're not allowed, you've got your button pressed.
Well, the previous motor's been voted on, Mr Mayor.
But I haven't said go. Thank you. Go. Oh, Councillor Cameron.
Thanks, Mr Mayor. Mr Mayor, I'd like to move that, and I believe it has been supplied to the staff. All right, that Council considers that the proposed schedule of fees and charges does not meet Council's expectation of achieving usage and accessibility for all elements of the community and declines to adopt a report. 2, the Council directs the General Manager to enter into discussions with Aligned Leisure to try and achieve an aquatics facilities fees and charges regime that A, does not include lane hire fees, or B, charges lane hire fees but does not require club members who hire lanes to be members of the facilities when training or competing, and C, provides for a concessional family rate with more flexible payment options.
Looking for a seconder. Councillor Vandervan.
Happy to second, Mr Mayor.
Councillor Cameron, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Mr Mayor. I'd like to dispel a little bit of zeitgeist getting around earlier before the beginning of the meeting, and that is what is the nature and what is the effect when Council resolves to note and receive a report. As we saw earlier in the meeting tonight with the action plans, when Council votes to note and accept a report, Council is endorsing that report. Council is saying that report is correct and that we don't question or we don't reject the factual basis on which it's formed or details in it.
Councillor Thurley, point of order.
Note and accept, it says receive and note.
Receive and note. Yes, I accept that.
There is no word accept in any of the motions, and we did not accept the action plans. We received and noted them.
I thank Councillor Thurley for his correction. He is completely correct, and that was my mistake in using the wrong nomenclature.
Thank you. I've received a note of that.
When Council receives and notes a report, Council is saying that that report is correct in substance and that Council agrees with that report and the actions or proposals that are outlined in that report. That is the case earlier in this evening when we received and noted the action plans, and the recommendations in this report themselves say that Council has two options. Council can receive and note the report, or Council cannot receive and note the report, can reject the report. So it is not simply a matter that if people vote to receive and note this report, that has an innocuous effect and it's a routine matter. It's more than that. And it's more than that for another reason. The reason that this report is before Council tonight is because that forms part of the contractual obligations of the tenderer. That's something that's been in the public domain for some time now. It's something that we need to be cognizant of, I think. And this is our only chance this year to provide feedback and direction to Aligned Leisure as to whether we endorse this the fees and charges. Admittedly, they have been modified and they have changed a little, but they've got to where they are now. And if we're happy with them, we should receive and note this report. But I propose that we don't do that. I think there are two very significant problems here, at least two, and they are, as I've articulated. And indeed, the report, in attempting to prove to us or to show us that lane hire fees are an industry practice, well, they certainly are a common industry practice, but they're not collected from regular users. All councils have them on their books. We've been through this in previous meetings and presentations, and they have never been collected from local swimming and water polo and I presume diving clubs here in Albury. That's not to say potentially we couldn't have a fee regime in the future that includes lane hire fees, but the equitable thing surely to do then would be to have a regime that said, well, look, you're like the footy clubs, you're like the cricket clubs, you're like the basketball clubs. You want to use our facility, we'll charge you for that, but we're not going to compel the members of your club to separately pay a payment to be year-long members unless they wish to be. Now, that would then put, and I'm quite attracted to that view, frankly, because that would put the water sports clubs on the same footing, as it were, as the other clubs in Albury. Now, to that matter, and as outlined by Mr Baker's presentation earlier this evening, it's not apples and apples. It's not the same. People say on its face, they say, well, you know, these clubs should contribute like football clubs do, and like cricket clubs do, and like all other clubs do. Well, the thing is, the two water sports are the only sport in town that use council facilities where we compel the people who are participating in those sports to pay a separate fee of membership of our facility. If I play basketball out at Lauren Jackson Centre, I pay the club and the club pays council. If I play cricket for New City Cricket Club, be an interesting site, then I'd pay about $215 a year and I'd pay $15 a throw for when I played, and that's my total cost for the year. But if you want to play water polo, for example, you have to pay in excess of $510 a year, made up of both your water polo membership of the club and your aquatics membership, which is clearly outlined in the report. And so it is not the same as other sports. And when people say, oh, I think they should pay too, I mean, I obviously have that view. You know, I've had my differences of opinion with various people in the water sports community over various things, but it is not the same. It is simply not the same. Water polo, diving and swimming sports are different, and their fee schedules are different. And if we're going to charge a lane hire fee, then let's explore the option of doing what some cities do that do charge a line hire fee, the few cities that do. Let's then not charge them or compel them to be members of the club as well. Now, personally, I think that's doomed to failure probably, because there is a reason that most places don't charge their regular users a lane hire fee. And the reason is very simple, because they are the bread and butter. They are the mainstay of the facilities. Without their continued use of the facilities, particularly in the early and late months of the season, the facilities become unfinancial. If I've learned anything over the last few months, I've learnt that. It's a fact, and that's the reason things are the way they are in the majority of cities around New South Wales and Victoria. There's a very different connotation in the statement that lane hire fees are a common practice to lane hire fees are a majority practice. Lane hire fees to regular users are not a majority practice, and for good reason. Thank you, Mr Mayor.
Thank you, Councillor Cameron. Speaker against, Councillor Con.
Thank you, Mr Mayor. Look, with some reluctance, no amount of spectacle over when buttons are pushed or over what it means to receive and note a report are going to get the results that the pool users in the community want to get. Noting that earlier in this meeting we received and noted a response from the Minister regarding T-Corp loans that obviously none of us were satisfied with, I interpret receive and note to mean I read the report and nothing else. We had a workshop just 1 week ago here where a large amount of information was provided by Aligned Leisure, where we had a large number of members of the community who were present. Arising out of that workshop were a number of very productive questions from councillors, a lot of productive feedback from the community, and we're still waiting for responses to questions on notice from that workshop. I think that the alternative being moved by Councillor Cameron tonight raises issues that were already raised last week. We're already waiting to hear back about all those things. And I don't think it's going to achieve anything different to the what's already happening at council, except to put it on a screen for those in the gallery tonight.
Thank you, Councillor Con. Speaker for, Councillor Vanderman.
Thanks, Mr Mayor. Last week's workshop was probably, well, it was significant. There was a lot of information provided and a lot of questions asked. And I'm disappointed that the concerns that I, for one, raised around the lane hire fees has not been taken on board by the staff. If you look at the attachment that accompanies this with the number of swimming clubs that, or swimming pool facilities that charge lane hire fees, there's quite a few of them that have them on their books, but there is no information, as there was none from our council staff, about how much of income from lane hire fees was actually achieved. And all I can ascertain from that report or from that document is, yes, lane hire fees are charged, but I would have thought with the questioning that I did last week that at least in that document there would be some information around what was the total revenue of that swimming facility and what percentage of the lane hire fees formed part of that revenue. But none of that was forthcoming. And I think on the basis of we need to get on the front foot here and get this whole issue put to bed, I think that this this particular motion is worthy of support. Thanks, Mr Mayor.
Thank you, Councillor Vanderman. Councillor Thurley speaking for.
Thank you, Mr Mayor. I'm a bit ambivalent in that receiving and noting the report was something that I intended to do, but in that debate I would have asked a significant number of questions of staff and required them to answer with an additional report. So in effect, all I see is that Councillor Cameron's motion asks the General Manager to enter into discussions, and I thought they were already happening. Perhaps this makes it more formal, and I would have been asking for further information from our staff, and that could have easily been accomplished in the debate and by receiving and noting the report with additional questions. Councillor Cameron's motion achieves that, so I'm quite comfortable to vote for it.
Thank you, Councillor Thurley. Question from Councillor Stotchbury.
Thank you, Mr Mayor. Through you to the member of staff who may be able to answer this question. Should this motion get up and the General Manager does enter into discussions with Aligned Leisure and some of A, B and C come to be reality, given that this is going to alter the financial arrangements in the contract, will this require a renegotiation of the contract, or is there some flexibility in the contract that we have with Aligned Leisure?
Mr Zagnich.
Thanks for the question, through you, Mr Mayor. I wouldn't want to preempt any of the outcomes of the discussions, but that'll be one matter we would need to consider in the negotiations. a variation of the contract is something that could be triggered. But again, Aligned have indicated that at the recent workshop that nothing's off the table, so we'd be taking them to their intent with respect to that most recent statement.
Comfortable with that? Yep. Question, Councillor Cameron?
Thank you, Mr Mayor. I don't want to be like a lion with a wildebeest on this, and I try and show respect for staff, and I'm conscious of wanting to put my questions in the most respectful way possible. I think it's fair to say that I've got some misgivings about some aspects of the report, and I've got a number of questions that I'd like to ask in connection with that, if you'll permit, Mr Mayor. The first one is a threshold issue. The report talks about a miscommunication, and Aligned Leisure certainly last week made it very clear to us that they came, and I believe they've acted in good faith for their part, that they came with the expectation of being able to charge a lane hire fee that was predicated on an existing lane hire fee of $25, which they proposed, I think, initially to be $27, which would be in the ambit of what was generally understood. I really would like to get an explanation, if there's one to be had, of why Aligned Leisure and presumably the other two tenderers it was not made clear to them that we do not and have not charged lane hire fees to our regular aquatic sports user groups. Through you to the most appropriate member.
Thank you for the question, through you, Mr Mayor. In relation to the previous contract and the tender process, it's a two-way process. The people who are responding to the tender have a responsibility to ask all the questions in order to best provide the answer. But in terms of what was provided, unfortunately, I'm not able to give you the answer because I was not at that stage involved in that process. So I would have to take that on notice. I was not part of that process.
Mr Zagnich.
I think what we need to be clear about is, again, if it's not been made clear, these lane hire fees are not charged by the council. They're not set by the council directly in the normal way that our fees and charges are for other sporting facilities. So there is a point of difference. Historically, the contractors that have been engaged over the number of years now have set the fees and charges. Granted, there was always a commercial lane hire rate set that is reflected in the report. Charging, though, for regular user groups wasn't the case in terms of Albury's pools that we're aware of historically, for a range of reasons, that some of which have been elucidated on this evening. So the expectation that tenderers may have had at that time hasn't come to fruition. Is that a matter for discussion with them now? It certainly is, and we'll be working through that if this motion proceeds on that basis. And even if it doesn't proceed, we'll be having that conversation as part of the attempt to resolve the issues that are still outstanding with the fees and charges process that the contract requires Aligned and the council to engage in.
Thank you, Mr Zagnich. Question, Councillor Cameron?
Thank you. And can I, just in reference to that last answer, can I say that this is a seminal matter, it's an important matter, and an answer must be had at some point to my question of why was it that the tenderers did not or were not made aware, and I intend to pursue that in the future. On
point of order, Mr Mayor.
Ms Councillor Salisbury, point of order.
That question was answered. The acting director said that it was incumbent on the tenderers to ask the question, and had the questions been asked, the questions would have been answered. So that was answered.
On the point of order, Mr Mayor, there is no point of order. What's your ruling?
Continue, Councillor Cameron. Have you got a question, further question?
Thank you, Mr Mayor. On page 135, I'd like to ask a question through you to the most appropriate member of staff. And I see, I believe the author of the report is here, so we might be able to get some detail. And I'll condense two questions I want to ask into one. The first of all, in the attachment which shows and this was referenced in Mr. Baker's presentation also, and in some correspondence we've received, I'm curious as to why GT Aquatics, who are a private operation, have been included in the attachment as one of the organisations that obviously charges a lane hire fee. And the second question is, on page 135, there's a chart which purports to show, and it says, the consultation for lane hire commenced with an information night on the 11th of July 2018 for all user groups, where updates and information were provided. And following this, Aligned Leisure had individual meetings. Now, I've got no doubt, and it's not been, put to me, that that scheduled meetings took place. That's outlined on 135. But to portray that as consultation for lane hire, when, to my knowledge, the aquatics clubs and indeed the water polo clubs were first told several months, or at least 2 months later than the 11th of July, that lane hire fees would be instituted. And in fact, the swimming clubs were told at least a week to 2 weeks later themselves, after the water polo clubs were told. So the first knowledge that the clubs had would seem to be well after the 6th of August. Yet this report is suggesting on page 135 that the consultation for lane hire commenced with an information night on 11th of July 2018. And I would like confirmation, as well as an explanation why that's being presented as consultation for lane hire. Were the user groups told by a member of Albury City Council staff, words to the effect that there would be business as usual in relation to lane hire fees, in that there would be none? Or is that not true?
Ms. Coate.
Thank you. Thank you for the question through you, Mr. Chair. In relation to GT Aquatics, the report provides an overview of all different types of lane hire practices and lane hire fees. So GT Aquatics also provide lane hire. They are one type of swimming pool where people can go to. It's just about providing some context. In relation to the business as usual, my understanding is that the business as usual quote referred to, your lane allocations will be as they are, your business will be welcome, and they'll work through the process. My understanding is that the $27 which the lane hire fee started at was then reduced and negotiated further down to the $10. So there was a process of consultation, but yes, of course, it could have been improved.
Councillor, can I just take a question from Councillor Con before you ask another question? Councillor Con.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Through you to the relevant member of staff. Based on many of the comments made during the debate, it appears that part 2 of this motion carries more weight than I originally interpret it to have. So I have some questions for the staff, please. The first one is that if we adopt part 2 of the motion tonight, that any financial implications of variations to the contract would be reported back to council as before final adoption.
Mr. Zachnich.
Yes, that would need to be the case.
My second question, that if part 2 is adopted, if that's going to have any impact on the City of Wodonga?
Mr. Zachnich.
It may do indirectly. The contract is directly between Albury City and Aligned Leisure with respect to Albury City facilities. So indirectly it may have an impact on the Wodonga situation.
Thank you. And my third question is to Councillor Cameron, noting his strong advocacy for not ever charging lane hire fees. Have you discussed this proposal with any councillors from the City of Wodonga?
Point of order, Mr. Mayor.
Councillor Cameron.
That's not my strong advocacy, as it's characterised by Councillor Con, for never charging lane hire fees. That's a complete invention. That's not my position, and that's not the text of my motion tonight. What I'm saying is that it should be either or. Either we charge lane hire fees and then don't charge memberships or compel memberships of the facilities, or it should be a regime where we don't charge lane hire fees. To characterise that as advocacy for never charging lane hire fees is just an invention.
Yes, I do accept that on the basis of the content and
I'm
the
happy
motion.
if that's the extent. Right.
Happy to reframe.
I apologise to Councillor Cameron and retract the statement. I'd like to reframe the question, please. Has Councillor Cameron discussed the contents of part 2 of his motion with any councillors from the City of Wodonga?
Councillor Cameron.
My personal conversations with councillors in the City of Wodonga or any other person are my own business, through you, Mr. Mayor. and I decline to answer that. But what I will say is that I have taken the time to research this contract and its structure and its effects, and I know that there are actually two contracts. There was one with us, as the General Manager alluded to, and there is one with the City of Wodonga. So to try and say that arguments or arrangements or negotiations that we carry out will have a knock-on effect to Wodonga are at best theoretical and certainly not legally binding. They have a separate contract, they administer, they implement. And it's worth noting that although I understand the text of the two contracts are the same, that Wodonga apparently proposes to deal with this completely under delegated authority and not do what we have done tonight and bring it before an open meeting of council in front of their ratepayers. Now, I'll make no further criticism or observation about that, but that's a fact.
Councillor Conn, did you have any further questions? No. Councillor Cameron, did you have any further questions?
Yes, thank you, Mr Mayor. Through you to the most appropriate member of staff, I understand that part of the contract, as is fairly standard with contracts of council of this nature, require the operator and the tenderer, the successful tenderer, to observe all appropriate industrial standards and instruments. Now, on taking over this contract, it's my understanding that the arrangements, like so many things under the previous contract for the Albury facilities, were a little bit opaque. And what I'd like to know, but conversely I understand that YMCA, and I know that YMCA, because I've read it, had an enterprise agreement with their staff. So what I'd like to know is, and the report touches on retention of staff and offering of jobs to staff, do our staff know, A, what conditions people were offered their jobs on in terms of their industrial conditions? Was it on the YMCA EBA? Was it on the Sport and Rec Award? Was it on the Fitness Modern Award? And what is the current prevailing, right now, the current prevailing industrial instrument that's being applied to the employees of Aligned Leisure? Because ultimately, A, we are responsible for any shortfall of wages, and that is in the contract. And B, the contract compels them to observe the applicable industrial instruments. So surely, I would hope that our staff, having oversight of the administration of that contract, can answer that question.
Ms Goad.
Thank you for the question, through you, Mr Chair. In terms of the actual specific of those details, I would need to take that on notice to provide you the exact award that the staff are under, but in all of our discussions, they are complying with all the appropriate awards as per the industry.
Mr Cameron.
So our staff can, the answer is that they're complying with the appropriate instrument, but we can't name the instrument.
Yeah, we'll take it on notice.
Happy to take it on notice, Councillor Cameron. Did you have another question?
Look, frankly, Mr Mayor, I could go on all night, but that's not going to improve things. So,
to talk to Councillor.
So you know, I'll
after the meeting on the operational matters.
Sorry, which one of us is speaking?
You're right. Keep going.
Thank you. I'm happy to approach the staff outside of work outside of this meeting on the operational aspects, bearing in mind that we set the policy that influences them what the operational aspects will be.
Thank you. Okay. So, Councillor Cameron, there are no further speakers or debate. Did you wish to close debate on your...
No, look, just very quickly, this is the appropriate course of action to take. It is foreshadowed in the contract itself that we would do this each year. Necessarily the first year, like new shoes, is going to be difficult and has been very difficult. There are some serious questions to be answered, and I look forward to getting answers to them in due course, but we now need to make this work somehow, and I believe that further discussions between the General Manager and Aligned is certainly appropriate. The only final thing I'd like to flag is the issue of family concessions. Family concessions, there's a part of the report that says family concessions are the same or less than they were last year. I'm afraid, looking at the figures, I can't see that. What I note is that there is no... The fact that the family concessions, as opposed to family... I'm sorry, a concession for a family, as opposed for a concessional family, if that makes sense. That is a family that is perhaps a healthcare card holder or an unemployed person. My rough estimation is that this new regime will cost them about $48 more than the old system, working off Lavington, where most of them are, given the socio-economic demographics of the city. $48 mightn't seem a lot to perhaps most people here and myself, but to a single mother or to a person who is on a disability pension who has children, that may well be the difference between the one small bit of recreation they may be able to have with their family, being going to a place like Lavington and enjoying the swimming and the children hopefully eventually learning to swim when those programs are reinstituted. And it can mean the world. It can actually mean the world to those children. Lavington Pool in particular, and I have been a very strong adherent of keeping that pool open and will remain so, provides a place in our city where people from often a lower socioeconomic background can get relatively, or could get relatively cheap entertainment for their children and family, and healthy entertainment and exercise. I implore Aligned Leisure to reconsider their current structure and to consider a further concessional rate for those people who are eligible for concession on a family basis. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Cameron. On that note, I'll put the motion. Councillors, those for the motion? Those against? The motion is carried. Thank you. The AlburyCity 2017-18 Annual Report, 14.7. Thank you, councillors. Councillor Thurley.
Thank you, Mr Mayor. I move that Council receive and note the AlburyCity 2017-18 Annual Report.
Thank you. Councillor Stutchbury.
Second that, Mr Mayor.
Councillor Thurley, do you wish to speak to that?
Simply to comment that it's an extremely high quality report and a credit to the staff who prepared it.
Thank you. No further question or debate. Happy to put the motion. All those in favour? Anyone against? The motion is carried. 14.8, the Code of Conduct Report 2018. Thank you, councillors. Councillor Thurley.
Thank you, Mr Mayor. I move that Council receive and note A, the Model Code of Conduct Complaints Statistics Report from the Complaints Coordinator for the period 1 September 2017 to 31 August 2018, and B, the update regarding the use of AlburyCity's Conduct Advisor Service.
Thank you. Councillor Stutchbury.
Second that, Mr Mayor.
Councillor, I have a question. Do you wish to open debate first?
I have a question.
Councillor Cameron, question.
Thank you, and I apologise. I think I should know the answer to this, but I don't. The new Code of Conduct in New South Wales, through you to the most appropriate member of staff, when is it implemented, or is it implemented now?
Mr Sacknich.
Thanks for the question through you, Mr Mayor. No, yet to be implemented by regulation. So once that's regulated, we'll be advised formally and then undertake a process of training and awareness across our council official group, councillors, staff and committee members, contractors, volunteers and the like.
Thank you. Councillor Thurley, do you wish to open or close debate on this item?
No, thank you, Mr Mayor.
Happy to put the motion. All those in favour? Anyone against? The motion is carried. 14.9, the Delivery Program Quarterly Progress Report, September 2018. Councillor Stutchbury.
Mr Mayor, I would like to move that Council receive and note the Delivery Program Quarterly Progress Report, September 2018.
Thank you. Councillor Doxey.
Happy to second, Mr Mayor.
I have a question, Councillor Stutchbury. Are you happy for me to take it?
Yes, Mr Mayor.
Councillor Con.
Thank you, Mr Mayor. I have a question, please, through to the relevant member of staff regarding the replacement diving structure at the Lavington Swim Centre. The delivery program states that should have been completed by the end of November, noting that it's the 26th today. Could we just get an update on that, please?
Ms Code.
Thank you. Thank you for the question through you, Mr Mayor. The diving boards have been ordered. They're coming all the way from the US. They're specialist and they will be installed in December.
Thank you. Okay. Councillor Stutchbury, do you wish to speak to that?
No, thank you.
Thank you. Happy to put the motion. All those in favour? Anyone against? The motion is carried. Delegates' reports for noting feral horse impacts. Councillor Thurley.
Thank you, Mr Mayor. I move that Council receive and note the feral horse impacts, the Kosciuszko Science Conference Report and the Basin Plan National Peaks Briefing Update.
Thank you. Councillor Doxey.
GG, happy to second.
Thank you. Councillor Thurley, I have a question. Do you wish to take the question first?
Yes.
Councillor Con.
Thank you, Mr Mayor. My question is actually to Councillor Thorley, please. I was quite disturbed to read that the OEH had prevented David Eldridge from presenting his report. I was wondering if you actually have a copy of that report, or if it's possible to obtain a copy to be able to read.
He does.
Look, I won't spend too much time on it. Snowy Monero Council alerted me to this issue, and I went to the conference in Canberra. So it was held at the Academy of Sciences and sponsored by ANU, Deakin and the Australian Academy of Science. There were a significant number of scientists speaking that day, but it became apparent because another scientist stood up and said, "You'll note that I'm not Professor Eldridge. Professor Eldridge has been banned from attending this conference or speaking about his paper." I would have to say that later in the Sydney Morning Herald there was an article in which the Premier denied that, and there was some other discussion that Professor Eldridge was in China. That was incorrect. He had been in China but was back in Australia on the day of this conference. So they specifically prevented him from speaking or attending. His paper was simply called Global Feral Horse Impacts and was a general paper about impacts of feral horses all around the world. In every other country they are significant problems, United States, in Mongolia, all over the place. However, to get back to home, I have the conference abstracts and I'll leave them in the council room as is my practice. The important issue is that it's not just an environmental issue, it's becoming an animal welfare issue. There are starving horses now in the Kosciuszko National Park, and because of lack of water and lack of feed, they are now concentrating on the small river and watercourses, causing extreme damage. They're endangering the corroboree frog, which is itself an endangered species, by their trampling of their breeding areas. So it's a significant issue. There are over 1,000 feral horses now in the Kosciuszko National Park. Their reproduction rate is around about the 20% mark, so every 4 to 5 years you've got doubling of the numbers. It's much the same in the Alpine Park in Bogong High Plains, but lower numbers. And the Victorian Department is culling horses in that area. The numbers are still around over 100 in that area. But basically, the consensus from all of these people was that the new act that the New South Wales government brought in will be a disaster. It does not include any scientist or land care manager on the advisory committee, just an advocacy group for wild horses, should I say. So I'll leave this. This is it was a pretty sad occasion to hear that the New South Wales government couldn't even have a scientist stand up and put his position. I thought that was very ordinary. The other one I went to the Peaks briefing on the basin plan. I was attended by a number of groups, and groups were enabled to put in submissions, and I note that Ramjo put a submission to that group. It was a MDBA update of what's occurring. In case councillors are short of reading matter, this is what I also got from those. I've got the Water Act 2007 and its updates, and I've got a copy of the Basin Plan 2012. If you want to wade through some stuff, they are interesting reading, and I'll make those available. If you don't want to read that much, I've got some key facts here, so in 5 minutes you can get yourself fully up to date. One of the issues that came up, and it's an issue that I've noted time and again, is that people see water flowing through the Barmah forest and assume that it's environmental water. It is not all environmental water. For the Murray-Darling Basin Authority to deliver the quantities they need to get to Lake Victoria, the Barmah choke will not allow that amount of water to pass. So earlier in the season they wet the channels, and then they allow the water through various side channels to go down the river and through other channels. The side effect, of course, is you get some environmental watering of the Barmah forest, but that water returns to the river. Environmental water, unlike irrigation water, does not just stop because it's watered the Barmah forest. It flows through the forest and keeps on flowing. So there are some serious issues and there is some misunderstanding, notwithstanding serious concerns about water availability and allocations. But I do note that in the Border Mail a week or so ago, Andrew Reynolds, who's the manager of River Ops for the MDBA, wrote an op-ed piece describing why the allocations between Victoria, New South Wales and South Australia are as they are. It is well worth reading, and my understanding is that Andrew Reynolds is a very approachable manager in the MDBA and would be happy to answer any questions that councillors have. I'll leave all of these in the council meeting room, in the councillor room in there for your information.
Councillor Vanderman, you have a question?
Thank you, through you, Mr Mayor, to Councillor Thurley. Just wondering if you could cut to the chase and tell me what the recommendations were from the professor that was banned from the conference.
He didn't have... His paper was simply a paper exploring the impact of feral horses worldwide and describing the nature of their impacts, which are severe. I'll just go back one step. Someone raised the issue of deer and pigs, and the fact of the matter is that a horse weighs 500 kilos and a deer might weigh 100. The damage caused by horses far outweighs what's caused by deer, and they had a number of plots where they'd fenced them off. The horse could reach in as far as its long neck would take it. The deer could jump the fence and get in, and so could pigs get under the fence. Those fenced-off areas looked like they were thriving grasslands, reed beds and so on. The deer and the pigs had not disturbed them to the extent that directly outside, 1 metre away, trampled, pugged, horse manure, the lot. So the horse is the first line of the problem.
Councillor Doxey, question.
Thank you, Mr Mayor. I want to simply make a statement. I want to congratulate Councillor Thurley on his enthusiasm and the effort he's put into his passion. Thank you.
Okay. No further questions or debate. Happy to put that motion. All those in favour? Aye. Anyone against? The motion is carried. Councillor Vanderman, you have a notice of urgent business? By the
no, Mr Mayor, I was going to go to confidential matters.
Oh, okay. We'll just check with anyone with urgent business I haven't been made aware of? No. Councillor Vanderman, wish to move?
Yes, Mr Mayor, I'd like to move that we go into confidential for 2 items. Waste curbside collection contract update, confidential item exclusive of press or public on the grounds that the matter relates to the matters and information of the following. D, commercial information for confidential note it would if disclosed. 2, confer a commercial advantage on the competitor of the council, Local Government Act 1993, number 30, section 10A 2D2, and CM 17.2, sale of land to recover unpaid rates and charges, confidential item exclusive of press and public grounds that the matter relates to. 2, the matters and information of the following. A, personnel matters concerning particular individuals other than the councillors, and B, the personal hardship of any resident or ratepayer, Local Government Act 1993, number 30, section 10A 2AB.
Thank you. Councillor Stutchbury.
Second that, Mr Mayor.
Thank you. Prior to going into confidential, I would like to ask anyone in the gallery if they've got any statements or no statements. I'm happy to put the motion. All those in favour? Anyone against? Let's move into confidential. Thank you.
I so move, Mr Mayor.
Thank you. Councillor Stutchbury.
Second that.
Thank you. All those in favour? And move back into open council. Thank you, councillors. Yeah, we did. Everyone's confused tonight.
Frank.
And we got to ratify this. Eh? Okay. Sure. We need those motions up on the... Hang on. I'll go to the motions. And we got them on the board yet, or...? I can read them here. Great, thanks for that. That's all right. Thank you, councillors. Just to ratify the business motions that were moved and seconded in confidential. Moved by Councillor Thurley, seconded by Councillor Doxey, curbside waste collection and contract update that Council 1 authorise the General Manager to finalise negotiations for a variation of the curbside waste collection contract to reflect the China National Sword Policy and container deposit scheme and as outlined within this report. And 2, receive and note the update on Cleanaway's expression of interest process for the establishment of a local food and garden waste processing solution. CM 17.2, sale of land to recover unpaid rates and charges. Moved by Councillor Vanderven and seconded by Councillor Stutchbury. The initial motion was moved. An amendment was proposed that became the motion. Was moved by Councillor Stutchbury and seconded by Councillor Cameron. That Council A, receive and note this report. B, resolve to sell the following properties in accordance with its powers under the Local Government Act 1993 for unpaid rates and charges. 1, Lot 104, DP 1077851. 2, Lot 4, DP 218342. 3, Lot B, DP 160775. C, authorise the General Manager to 1, appoint a real estate agent by such method that the General Manager deems necessary. 2, is instruct council solicitors to prepare a contract for sale for each property. 3, determine whether any arrangement other than full payment of the outstanding rates or charges will be sufficient to cancel a scheduled public auction. 4, fix the date, time and location of the public auction. 5, determine the reserve price for each property. And 6, execute the contract for each property in the event of a sale. D, hereby authorise its seal to be affixed to the contract for each property in the event of a sale. In the presence of 2 signatories, authorised to affix the seal pursuant to Regulation 400 of the Local Government Act, Regulation 2005, and the Council Senior Management of Legal Documents Advice Procedure. Both motions were moved, seconded and carried. Thank you, councillors. The meeting closed at 8:05.
I'm trying to press my question button, Mr Mayor.
Ah.
Just wanting to see if we could recommit that last motion because I wasn't asked to close debate on I was the original mover of the second motion.
But that motion was amended and it
amended,
became the motion.
but I was still the original mover of the motion.
No, I don't. Once it became a different motion, it became something else that was committed by the 2 movers and seconders. It was changed by the amendment.
Thanks, Mr Mayor.
Thank you. Meeting over. Thank you, councillors. Thank you, staff.